mainly talk about China and how it differs from us here in the West, in Europe and the rest of the world. Because I think that's probably what's most interesting. And I'll also talk about how it is to work for Chinese employers somewhat, and how UI UX design differs. China is different. Maybe comes as no surprise, but I'll go into some details. So, Chinese society is very collectivist, as opposed to our society, which tends to be more individualistic. There's more focus on working as groups rather than individuals. And people tend to identify themselves as these groups. It's family, and it's a clan, it's friends. To some extent, it's workplace, and your colleagues, your work. Although family always comes first. It's very hierarchical. That's a hard word. Hierarchical. Decision making tends to come from the top bosses, the managers, and I think we're a bit more autonomous here in Sweden, in Europe, as that even a low-level manager has a quite big decision-making possibility. Whereas in China, it's very top-down. Low-level managers basically just follow orders and make sure they're spread out to all the employees. And also at work, you can notice that family connections, family, etc., can have a lot of influence in how things are done. It's these kind of politics that you don't notice at first. It actually took me like 1 year of working in China before I started to understand, because my Chinese friends were telling me that, she's related to him, and that's why she's in that position, and that's why, certain orders or ideas are flooding down this way. And before you actually start to understand that or learn those kind of connections that are a bit hidden at first, it's hard to understand why certain things work the way they do. There's also a Chinese concept of harmony and balance, and that people try to maintain the status quo. There should be avoiding conflicts, etc. This can actually be a bit strange for a foreigner like me coming to China, because you can also see managers screaming at their employees in the office, and it seems like the very opposite of harmony and balance. But that's just one of many kind of strange things you see in China. There's also the concept of don't losing face. You don't object to anything the boss say in public, or at least if there's other people around. Even when everybody knows he's wrong, because that would make him lose face. But of course, this wouldn't work if managers just get a fixed idea and nobody can actually implement it. There's could be technical constraints that doesn't make it possible, etc. So there are ways around this, which has kind of developed over time. Polite ways of kind of sneaking in the back door and explaining to the boss that, well, this would be hard to do, and and yeah, it's a funny way of doing things, but once you get used to it, it's interesting. I noticed that as a Westerner in Chinese company, and there were relatively few of us at my specific workplace, we're considered in general to be very straightforward and outspoken, and this is sometimes appreciated and sometimes not. So it can be hard knowing when you are supposed to speak up and when you're not. But I mean, that's something you have to learn and feel on a personal level, depending on who you're speaking to and in what forum. And that also took a while to learn and understand. And Chinese don't say no. In this way, they are similar to the Japanese, that they very seldom say no directly to your face if you ask them something. It also goes with the concept of not losing face, that they don't want to appear, negative. So, and this is not just between, managers and personnel, but also between colleagues and friends. So, and they also reluctant to ask questions if they don't understand something, but they usually smile and nod, but even though they haven't actually got what you've been explaining to them or saying to them. So the best way to avoid misunderstanding, I found, is to ask for their opinion. But you have to be careful how you formulate yourself, because if you ask leading questions like, do you think this is possible? Then of course they're going to say yes, regardless if it's totally impossible or not. So you'd rather have to ask something like, do you see any problems with this approach? Do you have any feedback? And even so, they can be a bit reluctant to reply honestly. Here we see a couple of Chinese taking a nap, and this is something they do. At the workplace, maybe we should start with that actually, that after lunch, usually they take a nap. And where I worked, that happened that when you got back to the office flat after lunch, someone had pulled all the blinds, turned off the lights, and people were either sleeping on the desks, or the more professional ones had small beds they folded out and lay down for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then the lights go back on and you continue working. It's actually quite nice to take a nap in the middle of the day, if you ask me. Also, of course, there are lots of Chinese people, and their salaries are relatively low compared to Sweden or any other European country. So what would normally be considered a work for one person here is usually done by 2, 3, or even 4 people. In some extreme cases, more. I've seen like 3 or 4 people painting a fence with, a few meters apart, and one paints over here, one paints over here, and of course there's a 5th guy just managing them. It's long working hours if you're Chinese. Working at Huawei, we worked one Saturday every month. And if there was a holiday, say on a Tuesday, then usually you work the Saturday after to compensate for that free day. Which made me argue to my Chinese colleagues that it's not a holiday. It's just, you moved your Saturday to another day in the week, which they didn't really understand. But I could also mention that a lot of time, new employees. I mean, normal working hours is from 9 to 6 in the day, but new employees are on a trial period for 2 years, and they're actually expected to stay as long as their manager stays in the office, which is usually means from 9 to 9 on a normal workday. Sometimes even longer, depending on how their boss works. Now we're moving over to some more practical UI UX design in China. Any questions so far?
I just want to ask, is it the culture you see in startups when you're talking about the Hawaii big established company?
Well, Huawei is the one I have experience of, but it's pretty similar in most cases. There are some of the younger new companies that tend to have a little bit more Western-inspired, ways of working. So perhaps not working so late, etc. But in general, I think most of the companies do it basically like Huawei, that they work hard, they work long hours. But I've noticed that some of my younger friends in China seem to be, having the approach that, well, maybe not working is all there is to life, and maybe we want to go abroad, and maybe we want to work less. I mean, it's in that way. I think it's probably similar to Japan in that the older generation are very, working hard, working long, but the younger ones that have slightly better economic situation, etc., want to work less. So I mean, it's basically the same trend as here in that regard.
Seems like here it's more that the previous generations felt that they worked hard so that the future generations wouldn't have to work as hard or have as difficult. It seems like that's starting to catch on in the Asian countries too, but it hasn't really yet, because we hear a lot about people complaining about their grandparents or parents being very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Lifestyle choices or not working hard enough and stuff, even though here we do the complete opposite. Like, unless you're totally lazy, of course, here it's not like, I did this so you didn't have to. I worked my ass off so you could get an education and do something fun. You don't seem to hear that as often.
I was actually wondering, you mentioned that you worked in Huawei in both in China and in Germany.
Yeah.
Did you see work balance or work difference between the mentality in a way?
I saw a lot of the Chinese reacting to the difference, because when I was in China, most of the people I met have only been working in China. when I was in Germany, I had the opportunity to see how the Chinese reacted when they were abroad, and seeing how the Germans work. I mean, every Friday after lunch, the Germans went home, basically. So the building was half empty on Fridays, and after 3 on Fridays, it was totally empty except for the Chinese guys still working. And they noted this, of course, and I think it got them thinking a bit more about work, life, relation, because they commented on it and they asked me about it. That, okay, so don't they work overtime at all? And so, no.
So there was no assimilation between either side. So German people did their thing, Chinese people did their thing, and there was no really mixing between. And that's what you're saying.
Yes, more or less. I mean, actually, let's. I think I have to explain a bit. When I worked in Germany, I worked for Huawei, and who was doing work for Deutsche Telekom, which is the big internet provider and telecom company in Germany. So we worked inside the Deutsche Telekom offices, had a small office space reserved where we sat. So, and of course interacting with the Deutsche Telekom people all the time. So they were, had the opportunity to closely observe the German habits and how they worked, and they always commented on vacation times. In China, they have about 1 week of continuous holidays around New Year, and I remember I took a week off just going home, and said, "Oh, I was just home for a few days." What? It's like a vacation. I didn't feel like it to me, but so yeah. Okay.
The holiday times in Sweden.
Sorry. Yeah.
Did they have a heart attack? Or
Yeah. Almost.
died from
And also there's been some news circulating that in Sweden they have a 4-day work day, or that soon everybody in Sweden will only work 4 days in a week. Maybe you've seen it on Facebook, etc., which isn't quite true, but the Chinese were very upset about that. It seems we are very, very lazy people. So, anything else? Yes?
What you like about working with Chinese people? Anything you can learn?
Oh.
Takeaways?
They're usually quite friendly and open. It's perhaps not in the sense that they'll invite you home immediately. It sometimes takes a while to get to know them, but in general, they're friendly. They're curious about the rest of the world, and yeah. They also have this can-do attitude that I don't know how to express this well, but they set something as a goal, and then they just aim towards it and start going, and sometimes in a little bit roundabout ways, but usually they reach the goal sooner or later. And there is this kind of entrepreneur feeling when you're in China that people can just start doing something and work hard and earn money and if they're lucky they're gonna be successful. And it's not just in the tech industry. Every morning when I was walking to work, there was a noodle stand just outside the gates. And it was one man and his wife who were cooking noodles in a little van and selling it to. Ooh. Oops. Now I have technical difficulties. That's nicer. Now, as I was saying, you can see this couple. They started with a small noodle van and selling noodles outside the company gates. And then after a while, they upgraded the van. They got a third person helping out, etc. And you see this kind of thing all over China. And of course, a lot of it fails. You could see stores. Just in the neighborhood where I worked, there were stores and restaurants opening up all the time. Sometimes for a few months only, and then they closed down. But yeah. So there is a positive movement ahead all the time, which is fascinating. I mean,
Life is short. Maybe.
Sorry?
Life is short.
Yeah.
Because they are just targeting the short target and short aims, and they would like to make money in a short time. If they can do it. Otherwise, they just start doing anything.
Yeah. Oh. Okay.
So maybe it's best to focus on this.
Sorry?
And maybe it's best to focus on UI UX design.
Yes.
And then become a more.
We'll have time for more questions later. Oh. Yeah. I hope so, at least. Okay, I think I'll have to hurry up. I think a common misconception in the West is that China is, like Sweden or Europe or any other country, just that they're a little bit later, which is not quite true because they started later, a lot of the technology was always already more developed when they started, and that makes that contributes to some of the special cases that you can see in Chinese UI designs. So, first of all, it's a very phone-centric market, and I'll explain this here. In the West, responsive design is like the current trend that you design a website to work for the laptop or desktop and tablet and phone. Whereas in China, it's almost exclusively for phones nowadays. Of course, they still do have desktop experience, but smartphones are more important, are becoming more important. For example, this statistic is from last year. I think actually it could be from this year, but 88.9% of the internet access is done by mobile phones. PCs, laptop, and tablet are lower. I think it changed around 2013. That's when smartphone passed desktops in internet access. And also to note that this figure is going up while these three are going down. So the smartphone is the way you access the internet in China. And I mean, not just like we do here, check the weather or watch what's happening on Facebook, but also basically all kinds of stuff you do with the smartphone rather than your desktop. So many of the services target smartphones only and doesn't even bother about tablets or PC experiences. And one reason for this, that at least a contributing reason, is that about 13% of the population in China has a car. And if you compare to Western countries like Sweden, the numbers are around 50 to 60%. And if US is a bit extreme, it's one of the top three, and there's 80% of the people have cars. But in China, most of the Chinese are commuting by bus or train to work. And usually they live quite a bit from the workplace, so they have a lot of time to kill using their phones. So, and the phone number is very important. Email saturation is rather low compared to the West, but everybody has a phone. So instead of, if you log in a website in Sweden, usually they ask you email account, and you use that as your ID and then your password. But in China, it's becoming more and more common that you use the phone number, your phone number as the ID. And it's also password retrieval is done via the phone, which makes the phone more valuable to you, and also means that a lot of the Chinese go through the hassle of securing their phones in different ways, like associating it with their IDs to make sure that identity theft is prevented, for example. And if you lose your phone, you lose access to your social media, social networks, etc. So, some other factors that affects, this is the Chinese wall, and then there's the Chinese firewall, which you might have heard of. And it blocks access to a lot of websites and services, foreign, that is not under the control of the Chinese government. For example, Facebook and Google. I think in 2014, Google was totally blocked. All Google services were totally blocked. And this kind of, happens without warning or anything. Suddenly, I mean, you couldn't do Google search before, but suddenly you couldn't access Google Play at all. And I think now again that you can actually access Google Play, but only with a few applications, only free applications. And while there is ways to circumvent the Chinese firewall, most Chinese do not actually bother about this. What they need and what they actually use is behind the firewall. So it's only a few of the Chinese, like some of my friends, who had some ways of circumventing it when they wanted to look at certain websites. And internet access in China is still kind of varying in quality, especially in the rural areas. So the major sites are usually quite fast to load, but if you're outside of the big cities, it could be a bit of a problem. And a broadband connection in China, if you're gonna have it in your house or your home, then the price is about the same as in the West, which actually makes it very expensive in Chinese standards, unless you're very rich Chinese. And here are some Chinese characters. So text input in Chinese is hard. The number of Chinese characters is tens of thousands. But for being able to read normally, you need to recognize somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 characters. And this causes problem not only because it takes a while to learn, but also when you have input, you have to work a bit to write texts. I think pinyin is the most common text input method, and basically what you do is you type the English in Latin characters, the word you're looking for, and actually you get a number of options, and then you select which character you want. There are also other methods like writing. You write, if you have a touch, you can write on the pad and it recognizes the character. And also, what's else? Yeah, there is this stroke by stroke method where you kind of select each stroke in the character and build it up piece by piece. But due to this awkwardness of input, voice messages are much more common in Chinese. It's also easier for the older generation that perhaps are getting their first smartphones now and haven't learned pinyin or these other slightly complicated methods of text input. For example, Baidu, which is the Chinese equivalent of Google, says that 10% of all their searches are made by voice. And I tried to find some numbers for what is used here in Sweden or in the West, but haven't seen any. A lot of people have tried Siri, for example, on their iPhones, but there's still some kind of, people are a bit shy of walking around in public and talking to their phone or asking questions or doing searches, etc. Whereas that doesn't seem to bother the Chinese at all. So there's a different mindset there. You can often see Chinese, usually they hold the phone like this and talk to it when leaving messages.
In Chinese.
Sorry?
In Chinese, they just communicate in Chinese with the voice, etc. of Siri. So that's
Yeah.
would be improved, to avoid mistakes. That
Yeah.
Siri,
So,
how important is in crowded places?
sorry?
When you are in crowded places, there are lots of voices.
Yes, even so, I've seen people doing it. Maybe not if it's too loud around, but even on a crowded metro platform, you can see people standing and kind of talking to their phones and leaving messages. there's also a tendency for apps to do it all. In the West, we tend to have more like, single focused purpose apps in your phone. One example would be, for example, like Facebook recently split out the Messenger to be a separate app instead of keeping it in Facebook. Whereas in China, they tend to just, oh, this looks nice, let's add that, put a little bit of this and that. One example would be WeChat, for example. It's a chat application, and but it also does video calls. You can pay with a wallet. There's online shopping. You can collect your tickets and boarding pass in it. There's a game part where you can download games and play them. It has QR code scanning. There is song matching service, an email client, and also a custom web browser. So
Just a question regarding chat. Is it somehow popular to use WeChat with LinkedIn in China? Because LinkedIn has a link to WeChat as well. You can just put your WeChat QR code to just add someone on LinkedIn faster.
yeah, actually, I don't know how extensive that is. A few of my Chinese friends have LinkedIn accounts, but far from all. So
But WeChat is very common.
yeah, WeChat is, I would say, the kind of social network chat application in China. It used to be QQ, but WeChat is more. I think they have more users now since a few years back, actually.
If you compare that to like the operating system of the phone,
Hmm.
this looks like it would replace the operating system.
Almost.
But it acts as an app.
It's a single app that does a lot of stuff. Yeah, and you see this similar trend with other apps as well. That, for example, I think it's Baidu Maps that has what is it? You can send postcards with songs and voice and all this kind of stuff that doesn't really belong in a map app, at least not in our way of thinking usually. So I remember I had what do you call it, network drive, Chinese one, which was actually kind of filled with all these kind of different open source software. So it was a network drive for your home, but also BitTorrent client, media server. What else did it do? Well, almost everything. Music player, built-in, radio, lots of stuff. You got the feeling when you installed it that, okay, they just kind of picked all kinds of open source software and put it together in this device. And that's, I've come to understand, is kind of a Chinese way of doing it. Oh, this looks useful, let's add it. So, I'll try to make this quick, but download media. Almost all the media apps allow you to download content for later use. And that's films, music, TV, news pages, etc. And I think this is probably related to the cost of data services in China. So you can download if you're at work and maybe have free Wi-Fi there or an internet cafe, but on your way home, commuting in the bus, you can watch your TV series without, using up a lot of data on your account. Not the only store in town. Well, Google Play and iOS app stores are available in China, but there's also a lot of alternatives. For iOS, there are about like 3 major alternate stores to download from. For Android devices, there are around 10 major ones. I think.
Is the Apple's rules for iOS different in China?
Sorry?
Here you can't download from anything else but the App Store, but is the rules that Apple has set up for China different?
Actually, well, it's kind of not totally legal. At least I'm not sure about Android, but for iOS, I'm pretty sure it's not. But they found ways of circumventing it. It's been a bit of a battle because I think they had some way of loading without even needing to jailbreak your iPhones. I think they use some kind of a special, not sure what it's called, but unsigned or signed applications that it was intended for developers to allow them to, download their apps and try them out without having to, go through the App Store and have it certified first. But they kind of, misused it, I'm sure Apple would say, and used it to load the apps onto iPhones in China. And there's been a bit of a struggle, so Apple has upgraded the rules and ways in new versions to block it, but then they found other ways around, etc.
Does it look like Apple Store?
No, it's, I think I haven't actually seen it, to be honest, but the reason for this is, of course, cost, but also that it's perhaps, or at least it wasn't very easy for Chinese people to pay for Android or iOS apps because, the payment system weren't really in place, or it was awkward to pay. But also, it was a little bit poor support for Chinese language, and also the apps were perhaps not suitable for the Chinese market, or most of them at least. So this is what started the popularity with these alternate ways of getting apps in China.
Is this some explanation also for the WeChat, that once you have the WeChat, that's kind of an app store in itself? Once you have the application, then you can add.
There is not much apps inside of WeChat, for example, but they do games. But it's not like you can download any specific apps. You can add plugins and you can have links to, for example, companies, their web pages, or etc. But not really apps. No. I'm not sure if there is some of the other ones do something like that, to be honest. But nowadays, for example, the shops or the app stores on Android are made by some of the biggest tech companies in China, like Baidu, Tencent, Xiaomi, and also Huawei, have their own app stores which cater to the Chinese market with moon calendar apps, etc. So at least on the Android side, it's a little bit more legit nowadays. And QR codes are actually used in China a lot. Actually, you can find them like here on the subway. Ads have them all the time. So you can, when you're waiting for your train, you can just scan the QR code if it's something that interests you. You find it in restaurants menus, in TV ads even. Yeah, you have to go up to your screen and scan it. It's I have a hard time thinking that anybody would do it here in Sweden, for just at the TV, but it works in China. Actually, they kind of say that WeChat was the forerunner for this. That they had QR codes in China before, but wasn't extensively used. But WeChat implemented the feature, both a reader and that you could share your QR code with, actually show it here, with your contacts, and then you automatically link. And that made them popular. There's also a lot of half scary things, like you can download apps if you scan a QR code, which sounds a bit scary to me, but and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you.
There's thanks.